Welcome back to Burn the Haystack with Josh and Jesse.
I'm Jesse,
And I'm Josh.
and this is a show all about saving the best and burning the rest.
It sure is. And today we've got a lot of burning and saving. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's our goal every single episode, but I definitely think today is going to be a day of burning. That doesn't sound right. I don't know.
Sounds weird. Sounds weird. We shouldn't have said that, but let's keep it. We're going to be continuing our series on essentially looking at grace in the Old Testament, which sounds contradictory to some people. Last week we talked about like the law and is it like legalistic? And this week we're talking about a bright topic about genocide. Yep,
Yay!
This super happy thing to talk about.
Genocide.
Well, it's essentially, it's more, I guess we are focusing in on genocide, but it's kind of answering a big question about like a lot of violence in the Old Testament. So I think it's pretty helpful. I think it's pretty helpful to talk about. And there's a lot of things to go through with this.
Yes.
So we got some pretty helpful stuff for you.
Yeah, but I guess we should mention at the top of this episode that yes, we are talking a lot about violence this episode, and whilst I think that this is, we always try to be as family friendly and as sensitive as possible to people who have been affected by some really serious things. If this gets a little bit too heavy for you, then feel free to skip it. We do talk about some heavy stuff, but I think we're going to redeem a lot of it. So that's really helpful. So if you want to soldier through it, trust us, we're going to be gentle and we'll get to the other end together. Yeah.
And so again, we're not like a definitive source on all of this. We read.
What are you talking about, Josh?
No, well, I'm just saying,
the
like,
be all and end all.
Well, like, we're trying to cram this whole topic into a 1 hour episode, which a lot of people are like, an hour is plenty of time. But I'm like, no,
it's not.
There's whole books on this.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would recommend. Like, I think this will be helpful and give you some good overviews of some points. But if you want to go into like the real nuts and bolts of the history and all that kind of stuff and the context, language and all that kind of stuff, we're happy to recommend some books at some stage. Yeah.
This is a starting point. This is not the end.
Yeah. But so get in contact with us and we can help connect you to some books and resources on this sort of stuff too, if you want to go deeper. But yeah, today will definitely be a good start on it. Sorry if you can hear my phone clacking against the thing. All right. But first, any announcements, Jesse?
I don't know. I don't know. No announcements. I baked bread yesterday.
Nice.
I'm just announcing that just for people to know so that they know that I baked some bread.
Nice. I baked some banana bread last week. It's delicious. Yeah, and I'm about to bake some more today.
Oh, I'm so jealous. Maybe I'll have to make some banana bread as well.
It's very good, gluten-free. Yep.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but obviously before we get into it, we got to go through the question of the week, which I love doing.
I get the feeling that I know what question of the week we're going to do this week.
Whoa, really? Oh no! We last week we had a question, and then at the end of that question, I decided we should do the other side of that question coin.
Yep. Yeah, sure. Yep. Go with it.
So last week the question was, if you were like a villain, what would your villainous animal sidekick be?
Yeah.
And so this week it's, if you were a hero, what would your animal sidekick be?
Can you remind the people what your villain sidekick was? Because I think that's going to form a nice contrast to whatever your hero sidekick is.
A Canadian goose? No, I'm kidding. No, I think I went with a rhino. That's it. Which, that's looking back, I'm like, that was a strange answer for me. But I'm going to stand by it. I think he could be a very villainous sidekick.
I didn't mention it, but I was expecting you to just go full on big cat. Like, that's what I was expecting from you.
Yeah, I was trying not to be too, well, I don't know, because I was thinking like a lion, but then I feel like lions are very heroic, you know? And I thought tiger, I'm like, no, I don't know. I like tigers. I don't want them to be like associated with villains, you know? Yeah.
Fair enough.
Perhaps a panther or something. But anyway, I'm going to stick with a rhino.
A black panther would be cool. Anyway, yeah. No, all good. And I was a bear. All right, so do you want to go first? Or do you want me to go first?
You can go first.
Okay. Well, I hope I'm not stealing yours, but you did just mention it before. If I was a hero, I think my animal sidekick would be a Siberian tiger.
So specific. Why a Siberian tiger?
Well, because it's kind of topical, and I've been watching a specific TV show about tigers.
You have not been watching Tiger King, have you really?
I just watched the first episode last night because literally everybody is talking about it. So I can not it's like you either feel left out and just kind of play along with all the jokes and all the memes, or like you just dip your toe.
Yeah.
Karina was not keen, and I think after the episode she was also kind of not keen, but I think she was more keen than when she started.
Yep. I do want to watch it. I was just surprised that you don't seem like the kind of person who would watch Tiger King. That's why I'm surprised.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's definitely not the sort of show I would watch. I'm not a fan of like the deep South hillbilly documentary type like comedy thing. But look, it's interesting. It's real, which is probably what makes it even more insane. And that's why I'm choosing a tiger.
Redeem it.
The guy has over 200. I think it was like 220 tigers in his zoo. Just tigers.
That's crazy because, like, considering tigers are like an endangered animal,
there are more tigers in captivity in the United States than there are wild in the world. Yeah. Yeah. So
wow, that's a fact I didn't need to hear today.
Well, I mean, yeah, I was blown away when I heard that. The fact is that if all the tigers in the wild go extinct, tigers will probably not go extinct if current trends continue, because zoos and you can own a tiger. Apparently, I didn't know this. You can own a tiger in the United States. You can just own it. Like, you can take it home with you. It's crazy.
That is crazy. I would love a pet tiger. I would be terrified of a pet tiger, but I would love it. If it was loyal to me, I'd love it. But I don't feel like tigers can truly be tamed.
No, they're wild animals at heart. Even if you raise them from like a cub, they're still a wild animal.
Yeah, it's like foxes.
Yeah, or like wolves. Like you can never or a dingo. You know, like it's not possible.
Well, I mean, yeah, no, that's true. Did I ever tell you about that time I got to go in an enclosure with dingoes?
No.
Yeah, it's a photo on my Instagram to prove it. No, Danelle and I went to this wildlife thing, and then they had like, oh, you can have a dingo experience. We're like, what's a dingo experience? They're like, you just pay $40 and you both get to go in the enclosure, feed the dingoes, hang out, pat them, cuddle them, and we were like, yeah, all right. It was awesome. It was the best amazing. $40 I've ever spent.
Wow.
And yeah, it was great. I don't know how it's legal, but amazing. Like when you see them, you're like, oh yeah, they're just like dogs. But when you actually like are with them, they're not dogs. They're so different. Like their jaws, they're so much more flexible. Like their paws and everything can like twist right around. It's crazy, and they're just crazy. There's so much energy.
Wow.
But they're the size of like, I don't know, maybe like a golden retriever. Like maybe these ones were anyway.
Yeah.
But
dingoes are amazing.
They are. Okay, so your villain sidekick would be a tiger.
No, hero sidekick.
Sorry. Hero sidekick would be a tiger.
Yep.
You know, to be honest, I would have thought the other way around. I would feel like a villain would have a tiger and a hero would have a bear.
Maybe. That's like kind of like what a Jungle Book, Shere Khan type. You know, like the tiger is always the villain in the story if there's a tiger, right?
I'm thinking of World of Warcraft, I think.
Oh, yeah.
The bears are often like dwarf sidekicks, but anyway,
right. But is Alliance really the good guys?
That's another discussion. All right, that's its own podcast. Okay. All right. Mine, you know what? I can't get away from it. I think it's a wolf. Mm-hmm. You know, like a dire wolf kind of thing. I can't get away from the thought of them being like a great hero animal companion.
Yeah.
You know? Like I would think a lion, but lions, they just feel like if you're like the king or something, you know? Like but I wouldn't be, I'm just a general hero. So that would just be like, it'd have to be a wolf. They can smell I mean, if you can get a really big one too, then you could even ride it, but that would have to be a really big wolf.
Yeah, no, that's cool. What do you think? Okay, what do you think? Like, extra question. I'm asking the question this time. Okay, it's a question on top of the question. Okay.
Well, you're just playing that reverse card.
Yeah, bro.
Okay.
If you were like a fantasy character, like a fantasy hero, what do you think the ideal hero matching would be to your wolf? Like, what archetype would fit best?
I'm not sure what you mean. Can you answer for it, and then I'll...
Okay, so like, for instance, a tiger. Like, if I was a fantasy hero, let's say I was playing World of Warcraft, maybe like a troll druid. Is that a possible combo?
Yep.
You could be a troll druid. Like, it's jungle, it's connected to nature sort of thing. So a tiger would be like an ideal companion to a troll druid.
Okay. Well, okay. I think if I'm comparing it to that, then my problem is that animal companions in World of Warcraft are always only a hunter can have them. Yeah, so it's always like an archer or like a gun, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But if I'm gonna try and do my best to break that stereotype in my head, I still feel like a wolf is like you'd have like a bow and arrow, like a ranger kind of thing. You send in the wolf.
Yep.
Yeah. So I would say for myself, yeah, I would want to be like a bow and arrow kind of guy.
Like an Aragorn. Like, imagine if Aragorn had like a pet wolf.
How much better and how much quicker would Lord of the Rings have been if he had a wolf?
That would be so sick.
The whole thing would have been over in the first movie because it would have been like, whoa, guys, we got this.
Imagine like Aragorn riding a wolf versus like an orc riding a warg.
A warg, those like hyena things?
Yeah, I would say a warg is like a combination between like a wolf and a hyena. Yeah. Kind of like...
That would be pretty... But like a big wolf, like a massive... Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
One that he can ride, yeah.
Yeah. Because like a warg is like to a wolf what an orc is to an elf. Because in the Lord of the Rings, orcs are actually... used to be elves. That's what they are derived from. So it's like... So a warg is like a mutated wolf sort of thing.
Huh.
And huge.
I want to talk more about Lord of the Rings lore, but we'll do that. We'll do that at the end of the episode after the because I'm interested in this. We'll come back to it. We'll do this this will be post. So the episode might look long, but that'll be because the post discussion will be long.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
All right. Let's get into the other topic for today. The genocide.
The fun genocide topic that we're really excited to get into.
Yeah, it's just a weird thing to talk about. But okay, I just got to get out of that and just say it's going to be really helpful for people. Just do it, Josh.
Just do it.
Okay.
Just suck it up.
So, all right. So here's the big problem, right? So a lot of people, and this is what we talked about last week, they see the God of the Old Testament as violent, very different to the God of the New Testament. And I think seeing something like a genocide in Canaan, which we read about in Joshua, does not help the situation at all.
Yeah.
Especially for our culture, because we're just like, what? How could like a good, just God do that?
Yeah.
How could he command his people to do that? Is he condoning genocide? Like, that's crazy. And yeah, so for us, I think, yeah, I don't know, like and we mentioned this last week too. We don't live, at least in our part of the world, we don't live in as violent a culture as back then. I know there are still very violent parts of the world today, and I'm not denying that. I'm just saying the part of the world where we live and where our perspective of this is coming from, and the place where I think I get this objection the most is from people in the same sort of country as me.
Yes.
So, like in these days, growing up and having people around you die, seems really common. Whereas for me, and for our culture, it's not that common to have people close to you die until like later in life kind of thing. It's just not as common.
Yeah, I think most of the contact that we as Westerners have with really, really harsh realities like genocide is what we see on the news, and because our reality is so far removed from that, like if you're old enough to remember like the Bosnian war where, so many people, innocent people were killed in villages and in their cities, or even the 1994 Rwandan genocide, that just kind of comes out of nowhere and it just shocks you. Like, how is this even possible? How can this happen in the world today?
Yeah. Like, what kind of people would do that? You just can't even...
Yeah, you just can't even imagine it. Yeah.
So, yeah, like that sort of cultural divide makes it really difficult to talk about and to wrestle with.
Yes.
And which is an interesting thing, because you think about even like, I'll say 200 years ago, it seemed like people reading this stuff didn't have a problem with it. Like, yeah, that stuff happens. You know what I mean? That makes sense.
I mean, that's because 200 years ago, we talked about this last week, you know, to see somebody hanged in the village square was not an uncommon thing. Yeah. To see somebody, being hauled out of their home after dying from, disease or plague or an accident, that was just common, everyday material,
Yeah.
So I think we definitely live, like, we should be definitely thankful that we live in a time where violence and death and disease is not as common. I mean, obviously, it's kind of a little bit different, like, right now. But in general, we're very, I would say, privileged to live in a time of peace and relative. You don't have to, if you're a Westerner at least, and in most parts of the world, you don't have to worry about walking out your door and getting killed by a marauding band of cutthroat criminals, sort of thing. That's generally people don't get. Yeah, so I think that's what makes it really difficult, especially for us as Westerners, to read these stories of genocide and mass murder and try to figure out, okay, am I actually supposed to be going for the Israelites in this case? Because they get oppressed and they get waged war upon in many stories in the Old Testament, but at the same time, they're all often perpetrators of horrific crimes of mass genocide and murder. And all throughout it, God seems to be putting his rubber stamp of approval on these acts from time and time again. So how do we match up our modern Western post Magna Carta, post United Nations human rights sort of moral compass with these stories of genocide and murder? Is it even possible? Like, are we just so far removed from that culture that we can't relate at all? I think that's one of the biggest difficulties that we have with reading these texts.
Yeah. And I will say another problem with this too, before we get into it, is that it's like, you think about the current society we live in, how do I word this? Like, accusations are really easy to tweet, sort of thing. Like 120 characters, 240 characters. It's really easy to say, well, I don't believe in God because he's so violent. Look at the genocide in the Old Testament. You know what I mean? But to respond to it, it's very difficult to respond and explain it in 240 characters.
Yes.
Like, it's very difficult to give a quick, easy explanation to this question, because there's so many nuances, so many language things, so many like history you've got to unpack. It's very hard to give a satisfying answer to somebody in the current way that we talk about this. Like, even just the other day, so for those of you interested, I've been like doing some stuff on TikTok lately, right? Just trying to, I know, don't judge me, but it's an interesting field for ministry. So I'm trying to work out like how can we use it in an interesting way. And it's been really fun. I've been really enjoying it. But I got a comment, right? And guys, I did this thing about how to read the Bible every day, like how to get into those habits. And this guy commented back, and he's just like, I've got an easy way. Just don't read the Bible because it's full of bad history. And it just, and I'm like, oh, okay. So I started writing out a response, and the character limit just kept getting me. I couldn't word a proper response to him within the character limit. It was impossible, because you have to give an example, and then you have to share how that, and I'd have to write like 3 or 4 comments to just give one example, because the character limits are so short. So in the end, I just had to say, sorry, bro, I'm not an apologist, but I'm happy to give you some resources if you'd like them. That's all I could fit. And literally that was the max character limit, that sentence. And
wow.
And so I mean, he never responded. So I'm like, oh, well, that's fine. But I'd still be happy to like link them stuff if they want it. But you know what I mean? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of society we live in. And that's why I think online, that's why I see a lot of accusations against God, and the defenses are always look kind of mediocre. But if you read a blog or listen to like something long form or read a book, the defenses are quite good.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think we are transitioning. I think in a way, like, I think the last 3-4 years, we are transitioning from a tweetable way of gathering and distributing information to a more nuanced, long form way of like digesting content. Because I think that for the longest time, I think we've talked about this before, but I think for the longest time, like news outlets, radio, television, etc., has been condensing information to the sharpest, snappiest, quickest bite size, because advertising space is really cutthroat and airtime is really small. But now with the rise of independent media, like what we're doing right now, is allowing people to actually digest information, more long form information. I think people are actually starting to want that, rather than like, what does the Reddit article say? What can I read from the headline? And I'm just going to make a comment right now. Like, people still do that, but I think more and more we are moving to a place where people are wanting deep analysis, which I think is good, but I don't think everybody's coming on board with that. But I think we are moving there slowly.
I think so. But there are also like blogs declining in popularity.
Yeah.
Podcasts are rising in popularity. So I don't know, there's a little bit of both there. It's an interesting time, and like even like TikTok is rising in popularity, and the limit on those videos is 1 minute. But the ones that are under 30 seconds perform best. So interesting, like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something, I guess, but that's a side point, I guess. So I think that's the tensions we're wrestling with here in our modern society are really in those two sort of things.
Yes.
So in this podcast, we've got basically 4 main points that we're going to go through. Should I give them the roadmap now? I'll give you the roadmap now.
Yeah, go for
and
it.
Then we'll so first we're going to look at like who the Canaanites were, because that will help you to see why God might have said this. We're also going to give you a look at like God actually working with the Canaanite people behind the scenes a little bit. Like some stuff that God was doing that a lot of people, it's like a little bit of a nuance in the story that a lot of people don't notice. Then we're going to look at the language that's been used. That it's sort of like this overly emotive language. And then we're going to look at Jesus, because that's where every good sermon finishes. You always land the plane with Jesus. That's how you do it. You land the plane with the gospel every time. So that's where we're going to land the plane.
Amen, Pastor. Should we start with a little bit of context of where we are in the story of the Israelite people?
Sure.
All right. So we are basically doing a skip, hop, and a jump from God giving the law to the Israelites at Sinai. They're in the desert. They've just escaped from Egypt. They're wandering around, and they end up through a whole series of episodes of them basically letting down God and letting down themselves. They end up wandering for about 40 years, and basically an entire generation passes away, save for a handful of people. And after Moses dies, Joshua, his right-hand man, basically steps up and becomes the de facto leader of the Israelite people. And as the older generation has passed, a younger generation is here, and they are ready to rumble, and they are instructed by God to cross the Jordan River and to conquer this land that they've been promised for like the last 40 years. It's theirs for the taking, and they basically go from city to city, town to town, raising fortresses and cities and towns and killing people and taking over the land like a conquering nation does.
Yeah, sounds pretty good. Yeah. I don't think I have anything to add to that. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so, but you raised a good question, and that's the question that we're going to start with. These people that they're conquering, who were they?
Yeah, so the Canaanites, interesting group of people, but if you actually read about them from the Old Testament, you you would definitely see some. I would actually argue bigger problems with the way they functioned as a people. They definitely had some really dark practices, and they, I don't know, like there was some really dodgy stuff going on across that nation, and I would actually argue that they were a threat to themselves and the nations around them. That's how I would argue it, and to Israel too, like God's people. And so you got to remember, like, God, part of what God is doing is He's also looking after Israel as His chosen people. I feel like there's a little bit of a nuance that you see through the Bible that He is actually working with other people around, but Israel seems to be the one that He's like working with the most. But anyway, we'll come back to that later.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I think that's right. In fact, we see in Deuteronomy 9 verse 5, God actually gives a little bit of an insight to this to the Israelites. He says, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation, "It is not because you are so good or have such integrity that you are about to occupy their land. The Lord your God will drive these nations out ahead of you only because of their wickedness and to fulfill the oath He swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So in other words, like, God isn't building up Israel and saying, hey, you guys are so good. He's actually saying, look, the wickedness of the people necessitates a hostile takeover, that they are actually a poison to themselves and to you. And we see this illustrated over and over again. You know, we see the Israelites getting close to some of these neighboring nations and ultimately becoming corrupted through them. We see it while they're wandering through the desert. We see it after they've conquered the Canaanites. And spoiler alert, they don't actually wipe them all out. They actually leave many of them still alive, which become a real problem for them, for the Israelite nation later on.
Yeah, that's something you actually see. The Book of Judges. I don't enjoy reading the Book of Judges because it's a very heavy book, which I've talked about many times. But that's part of the interesting way the Book of Judges is written. It starts off describing all these heinous practices of those other nations, and it's got this spiral of violence where the nations are doing horrible things. Israel starts doing those things or doing part of those things. God raises up a judge, brings them back, and then they get even more violent. Like, then they thank God, they're like, yay, and then eventually they just slip back in and become worse than they were before, to the point where it spirals to the very last two chapters, which are absolutely horrible, where they're doing the exact same things, if not worse, than the other nations around them. Like, they just become the very thing God was trying to bring them out of. That's exactly, and I think that's part of the reason here, is that, like, these practices were so horrible that God was trying to, like, build a new people who wouldn't do any of this stuff. Yeah.
And funnily enough, the Book of Judges ends with an entire tribe basically being genocided because of this horrible thing. And it's really tragic. And it actually ends with the, I guess, possible worst consequences for practicing immoral things, like having your entire subgroup wiped out because of what you're doing. So if anything, that should give you a clue that God's actually not that cool about genocide. He actually, it's like possibly the worst thing that could happen to you and to your people.
Yeah. Oh goodness, I just dropped my phone. Sorry. So my case broke, and so it's all slippery now because there's no case on it. But anyway.
Youch. That's scary.
Yeah, and if you would like a detailed description of some of the things that they used to do in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it does have descriptions. But for example, and if you have a weak stomach, then feel free to skip the next few seconds while I describe one of the things they used to do. But they perform child sacrifices. One of the things that they would do, their god Malik?
Marduk.
Yeah, Marduk. So when you got a house, your firstborn, you would have to sacrifice that to Marduk by basically placing them in a very hot statue of Marduk, and it basically cooks them alive. It's horrible.
Yep.
As a baby, and then they would build the corpse into like the walls of the house and that was a sign of like the house being protected by Marduk, and you weren't allowed to show any grief you weren't even allowed to show a hint of grief because that would basically like cancel out the sacrifice. So you weren't even allowed to be sad about it. You had to do it. It's horrible.
Yep.
Oh, I feel sick just describing it. And I hate that people have to listen. But that's just, for example, what they would do.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to some of the other practices that they got up to. We don't have to describe all of them, but that's your taster. That's possibly one of the worst things that they did, but they did many other things. Sexual immorality and depravity were just rife. I can't imagine how infected and how many diseases were being transmitted from people to people. We don't really think about that these days because, we read the Bible and we just think, oh, yep, that's just what they were doing. But if you can imagine some of the STIs that exist today, they are not 21st century inventions. They have been around for millennia. Yeah. So not only were these people really, really heinous in the way that they were practicing their spiritual lives, they were partaking in all sorts of physical things that were causing deformities and diseases and infections and just completely demoralizing, dehumanizing and destroying their bodies and their minds and ultimately their societal structures, because that's really, I think, when it comes down to it, the thing that God was wanting to break down the most. Not kill people, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but actually break down and dissolve the societal structures that they had built up around all these practices.
Yeah, and so I think there's some real heinous stuff going on, and it's disgusting for us to it's disgusting to look at and read about, and I hate it.
Yeah.
So you can see it's not like these people were the most innocent. Do you know what I mean? It's not like it's not like they were doing good things, Sure, maybe there was some good in there too, unfortunately. But at the same time, something we have to remember is, and I think we brought this up last week too, they didn't have jail systems and penitentiary systems like we do today. So it's kind of what's the alternative here? I don't know.
Yeah.
Because another complaint I get a lot is why are all these bad things happening? Why doesn't God do something about them? So back then, God does something about it. People complain, and then if he doesn't do something about it, people complain. What does he do? I don't know. It's pretty difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't want to be in God's position. I would say that. No, that's absolutely true. I think one of the best analogies that I've found that John Walton actually uses, he's the author of the book The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest, which is a great book. I've only read little bits of it, but what I've read have been really excellent. He basically compares the way that the Israelites drove out the Canaanites to the way that the Allies drove out the Germans from Western and Central Europe during the end of World War II. So the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy, and they swept through France, and they swept through all these occupied nations, driving the Nazi forces back to Berlin. They didn't kill every single German that they encountered. What their goal was to dismantle the political and military structures that the Nazis had set up throughout Europe to ultimately dismantle the Nazi empire. That was their goal, and that is ultimately what they achieved. And I think that's the same sort of thing that God is trying to do here. He is using the Israelites to sweep through these Canaanite nations to dismantle the military, political, spiritual, social structures that they've set up, because ultimately those structures are oppressive, they are dehumanizing, and they are driving the people who are under them, the innocent people, into a subhuman way of life. And ultimately, that's what God is doing. He's using the Israelites as liberators to liberate the people that are under this yoke of depravity and oppression to a better way of life. That's what God's ultimate plan is for the Israelites in general, that they would be a nation through which all other nations are blessed.
Mm. And that's the thing, you look, and this is what we talked about last week too, like you look at the practices of Israel compared to the other nations, and they, like at the time, and everything they did was so wholesome and would actually be a blessing if people followed them. That's what God was pursuing.
Yeah.
So you can see why he had to dismantle these other nations in order for Israel to be that blessing. Which is hard. It's hard to read. It's hard to think about. But that's just, it's part of the consequence of like our sinful bent nature, we're like bent to that. And this is like a picture of what happens when we fully just give into that almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
Should we take a quick break?
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool.
So getting into the actual genocides themselves, specifically the places that Joshua and the Israelite soldiers attacked, we see a story, a narrative, starting with Jericho. That's the really famous one. And there are other little towns like Ai, Eglon, and Debir, and many other little towns and cities that we see the Israelites attack. And a lot of the time when we read these, we read them like flipping the script, like we just talked about the Allies attacking the Nazis. Well, sometimes it feels like the Israelites are the Nazis on this blitzkrieg sort of warpath, just barreling through these cities and towns, wiping out little shop holders and women and children and people in fields, like absolutely just military massacre of civilians and innocents. But there's a book actually by Joshua Ryan Butler. It's called The Skeletons in God's Closet. And in his book, he points out something really quite interesting. He points out that the towns and cities that are named and mentioned, at least those, there may have been others, but at least the ones that are mentioned, they're all military strongholds. They're not civilian centers. So when I thought of Jericho when I was a kid, well, honestly, when I thought of Jericho when I was a kid, I thought of the VeggieTales version with the two peas, the two French peas on top, doing the parody of Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
But when I thought of Jericho, I thought of, yes, it's a walled town, it's a walled city, but there's people inside with there are people selling bread, and it's just a regular schools and businesses and services and things like that, but actually, what Joshua Ryan Butler points out is that Jericho and many of these other towns, they're actually military strongholds. So they're walled cities because, for instance, Jericho is on the border between the Jordan River and the desert. So it's an exposed place. It's a fortified place. It's a stronghold. It's a vanguard against invaders from the direction that the Israelites come. Makes a lot of sense on a military level. So when it comes to these towns, they're not actually strongholds. In fact, here's what Joshua Ryan Butler says. The cities Israel takes out are military strongholds, not civilian population centers. So when Israel utterly destroys a city like Jericho or Ai, we should picture a military fort being taken over, not a civilian massacre. God is pulling down the Great Wall of China, not demolishing Beijing. Israel is taking out the Pentagon, not New York City.
Oh, what good modern analogies. That's so well done.
That should also come as a criticism to every sci-fi director who makes the aliens pop out over New York City as if New York City has some sort of military strategic value.
True. It's always New York. Why is it always New York?
I'm looking at you, Avengers.
True. Yeah. Why? Anyway, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that does actually already just that I think makes this a little bit easier to understand in the context of that Old Testament book. The fact that these people were really heinous, depraved. Is that a good word to use? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they were sort of toxic to where they were and the nations around them. and the places that they attacked were sort of dismantling their strongholds, not necessarily their civilian population centers. So I think already, like, that's a good start. But we're going to keep going.
I should mention, though, before we move on, there is one other thing. I know we've given you guys a lot of things to look up, but if you want to look up one other really interesting thing, go to Deuteronomy chapter 20. And in that story, we see that God sets out a set of rules of engagement. So throughout the entire story, we don't often see it, but what basically happens is God says, hey, when you go to a city, offer to make peace with them. And if they want to make peace, these are the terms that you will have to offer. And we don't see it every time, but actually the implication is that every time Joshua comes to a city, they would give their terms and they say, we want to make peace. We don't want war. Here are our terms. And most of the time that's just rejected. Not always. So we see that in the case of Rahab when we go to the city of Jericho and she says, hey, look, when you guys come in and take over, spare me and my family. And there's no sort of like haggling. There's no sort of like negotiation. They're just straight up, yeah, absolutely. You know, you helped us. You're wanting protection. You respect our God. So we will protect you. And they keep their word. Same thing with the men of Gibeon, you know, that little town that basically tricked Joshua. Even though Joshua was like super mad when he found out the Gibeonites tricked him, he still honored his word. He still actually gave them protection. And actually, a few chapters later, the Gibeonites are attacked by a neighboring city-state, and Joshua comes to their aid and protects them, even though they tricked him. And you would think that like in an ancient time, it's like, you tricked us, we'll kill you sort of thing. No. They have a sort of a Geneva Convention before the Geneva Convention of how to engage. So
wow,
they don't have to, but they do.
So there's even like a lot of grace in that, which is amazing. Yeah. Such little. That's the thing. See how there's like all these little nuances in the story, the way it's written that people miss. They just see the big thing.
Yeah.
And to be fair, it is a big thing. I get it. Like I'm not, but
yeah.
All right, let's talk about was God, because a lot of people think like, wasn't there another way God could have done this? Like, isn't there another way God could have, I suppose, like shifted the Canaanites away from doing this kind of thing to maybe help them to be a more positive nation, to not be doing all this horrible stuff. And to be honest, he was actually trying other ways first. And so we're going to check that out, that God was actually kind of working a little bit behind the scenes with these people before it came to this, which most people don't talk about, they don't see, but it's right there. It's right there in the text. Jesse, you wanna lay it out for us?
Sure. Well, I think it's often easy for us to assume that the only nation that God really cares about is the Israelite nation, and to be fair, most of the screen time is given to the
screen time.
Page time is given to the Israelite nation, the generation of Abraham. But all the way back in Genesis, actually, God is talking to Abram back before it was Abram, and he talks about nations that he's actually working with. And you do see this even throughout the minor prophets. Like you see God saying, hey, look, I reached out to these people. I tried to work with these people. And it's always kind of like thrown back in God's face. So God doesn't have favorites. I think it's like we're all his favorites sort of thing. But some people choose to respond and some people choose not to, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, Israel were the chosen nation, but it doesn't, in my reading of it, it doesn't mean he loved them more than everyone else. It kind of means he'd chosen them for a purpose to be that nation and be that blessing to others and to be where the savior of the world comes through. Do you know what I mean? Like they had a purpose is what he chose them for, not because he doesn't love everybody else.
Well, I think ultimately, like God's purpose for the Israelite nation was that they would be so influential to the nations around them that every nation would be Israel. After a while, like God would work through the Israelite nation to be a blessing to all the nations and would make all the nations fear God and walk in his wisdom in the same way that Israel does. So
and I think that's why throughout the Old Testament you see
and archetype
so many inclusions of the internet went a bit weird. You see so many inclusions of people joining Israel, whereas I don't think if it was an exclusive, like, no, God is only there for these people, there wouldn't be like inclusions of people joining. So like even when they left Egypt, you see like little inclusions of some Egyptians joining them. When they when they took down Jericho, you see like, oh well, Rahab and her family, they join. You see it like over and over and over. Even when you get to the New Testament, there's parts like in Acts where it talks about how the Pharisees joined the Christian movement. It's constantly this story that God's love and his choosing is for everyone. He wants them to come into what he's making, which is an incredible thread that is just sewn right through. So anyway, that's just a little side point, getting my preacher on. All right.
So another name for the Canaanites were the Amorites. You may know that, and that's a more ancient name for them. But when God is talking to Abram in Genesis 15 and verse 16, Genesis 15 and verse 16, when you're there, everybody say amen. All right,
amen, Pastor.
Now I'm the pastor. I'm missing preaching in front of people now. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. So the implication here is that God is actually trying to work with these Amorites. He's trying to work with them, and he's saying, hey, look, the Amorites, they're on a track, and I'm trying to work with them, but if that wickedness and that the sins that they are committing right now exceed a certain point, I'm going to bring your people, Abram's people, back here and give you this land, because the land that I've given to the Amorites, they're squandering it. They're not, using it wisely. They're not using the information and the resources wisely, all that sort of thing. So that's it. It's little hints. It's quite subtle, but you can see that story going on in the background.
Yeah, it doesn't help that there's 2 separate names, but
sure.
anyway,
True that.
So God was trying to work with them behind the scenes. He wanted them to be a part of it, but clearly, in
not playing ball.
Some point in history, they chose not to. They kept going down their path. And so I guess, that's how I make sense of this, that this was the only option left for God. I don't think this was his first choice.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's clearly not his first choice. I don't think it was his second or third either. But
I think this is the problem with the Bible. And I know that sounds kind of controversial, but as much as we as Westerners, we have this very linear view of history of okay, these are the events that happened in sequence, and this is what led to this, and here are all the details. Ancient history does not care about our modern sensibilities. It does not care.
Yeah, they write history differently than we do, and than we want even.
Yeah.
Even prior to the 20th, 19th century, 1900s. Even history back then was written differently, let alone to what we want now. Now we want a detailed of everything that happened minute by minute by multiple sources. That's just not how it worked back then.
Yeah. So there's a lot of guesswork and educated assumptions that you have to make when you're reading stuff like this. And I know that kind of sounds dodgy, it's the Bible. We can't really do that because it's the Bible. But at the same time, it's not giving us everything. You have to make educated guesses, and you have to try and fill in the blanks tentatively, not holding on too tightly, because otherwise, what else are you gonna do?
Yeah, and unfortunately, this is a part of the thing that people who are arguing against Christianity and that kind of thing, and they're arguing against this kind of thing, they'll be like, "Oh, you're just making stuff up to defend it." And you're like, "Well, I kind of have to." You know what I mean? I'm not making stuff up, but I kind of have to fill in the blanks. You're making me defend something that's thousands of years old and has limited historical resources on. It's kind of I don't know. Anyway, it's part of the problem as well. How our modern mindsets play so many issues into how we interpret the Bible and how we see God and all this. Anyway, that's endless problems we're dealing with. Not that we have all the answers, but we're working through it too. Yeah. Cool. So, sorry, just a little bit lost in our notes. Okay, there we go. Any other thoughts on God working behind the scenes with the Amorites / Canaanites? Are you good there?
No, I think we're good there. We already touched on it a little bit towards the beginning, so I think we can move on because there's some other stuff that we probably should cover, because I think a lot of people, like, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, yeah, okay, sure, but like, what about the actual killing? Because there's like parts in this where it actually says, and then they killed everybody, and so what about that?
Yeah. So one thing here with the language that's used, and we don't like, a lot of people don't like to say this kind of thing when it comes to the Bible. But the Bible, you got to remember, it's written by language. It's written in a language that was used by people who were just like us, that's real people in real times, in real history. They had ways that they would say things that weren't necessarily
100% accurate to the actual events that actually happened.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't want to say it like that, but okay.
No, but that's just the fact of the matter.
Yeah. Okay. So say I was watching a footy match. As in AFL, Australian Football League.
What is that? I don't even know what that is.
Geelong, my team, absolutely wrecks. I don't know. Who's your team, Jesse? GWS?
The West Coast Tigers.
Who are the West Coast Tigers?
Isn't that the Perth team? Or is that the
West Coast Eagles?
Oh, Eagles. My bad.
Okay.
My bad.
Sorry. Yeah, you're more of
Fremantle? I don't know.
Oh yeah, Fremantle. Yeah, we can say Freo. Okay, sorry.
Freo.
So, all right, so it just comes out of me. All right,
Geo versus Freo.
All right, so say my team, they win and they absolutely they double the score of Jesse's team, right? And then I talked to Jesse the next day. I'm like, mate, did you watch that footy match last night? Geelong destroyed you guys, like absolutely wrecked you. And then you can be like, no, Josh, they got on the plane the day after and they went home. They weren't destroyed. They weren't killed. What are you talking about? They were completely functional afterwards. But I'm like, but I mean, like, you got wrecked. Like, no, we weren't wrecked. We just lost the game, Josh.
That's like such a Sheldon thing to say.
It really is. But I mean, that's what I mean. Like,
yeah.
And I'm not saying the Bible is like deliberately lying about it. I'm just saying I feel like they use language to describe things in a way that goes like further than what actually happens in a way.
Yes. So I think probably for those of you who are listening and thinking, okay, you're totally diving off the deep end. It's the Bible. It's got to be true. It's got to all be true. Otherwise, none of it's true. Yes, I used to think that way as well. But I think one of the things that we need to get to grips with is the fact that, as we mentioned before, ancient writers, and especially ancient historical writers and historians, didn't have the same modern values that we have today. So today, we would have a very difficult time believing a story written about a true historical event that happened yesterday, let's say, if a bunch of the facts were incorrect. We would just throw it out. Like, we could probably do a very deep, divergent side note into fake news and to all that sort of stuff, but that's a different story. The fact of the matter is, if a news article came out about something that happened yesterday, let's say or what happened today about Boris Johnson being admitted to hospital, right? Mm. If we were reading that and a bunch of the facts were just wrong and were proven to be wrong, you wouldn't have much faith in that journalistic entity. But when it came to ancient writers, the facts were often not as important or easily recorded as the story that the writer was trying to tell. When it came to ancient historians, they were telling the story of their nation. They were telling the story of their people. And so if the facts were kind of mediocre, or if the facts were not all easily gathered, or like you couldn't collate all of them as easily because they didn't have reporters on the ground, going live back to the studio. Yeah. Like, just things weren't as easy to gather. And especially if you believe that Joshua was written many, many hundreds of years later in a completely different setting, it's really difficult to be able to pinpoint, okay, this is exactly what happened.
Yeah. Now, just to clarify, before people, I'm sure there are people right now screaming heretic at whatever they're listening. We're not saying that the story is untrue. We're just saying the way that it's told doesn't necessarily go in line with how we would retell a story that happened, right?
Yes.
Like we would want the exact, like, you know, whenever there's a big crisis, we want the exact numbers and all that kind of stuff. If even one number is off, people go crazy at that source. Whereas, yeah, like what we're saying, they didn't necessarily write it like that. And we can prove it to you, to be honest. It's
Yes, that's
within
exactly.
the Bible.
We actually. All right. So, do you want to read the first bit and I'll read the second bit, or do you want to do it the other way around?
I'm a little bit lost. Wait. Oh, all right.
That's
example
fine.
1. Yeah.
I'll tell you. Do you have example 1? Joshua 10, verse 38 to 39.
Wait, that's not what mine. Oh, sorry guys, a little bit lost in my notes.
These are my notes. Sorry.
We have more notes on this episode
I'm looking at my
than we
notes
normally have.
and looking at Josh's notes at the same time.
The what? What?
So my example, I'll read my example.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so my example is a description of Joshua and his soldiers conquering a little town in Canaan called Debir. So here's what it says in Joshua 10, verse 38 and 39. Then Joshua and the Israelites turned back and attacked Debir. He captured the town, its king, and all of its surrounding villages. He completely destroyed everyone in it, leaving no survivors. He did to Debir and its king just what he had done to Hebron and to Libnah and its king. And then it goes on about all the other things that Joshua conquered out of that. Now, that seems pretty clear cut to me. It seems that Joshua just completely destroyed everything that was in the town and he killed everybody. Like, does that seem pretty clear to you, Josh?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. All right. And then what? Do we go into Joshua 15, 13 to 15?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, yep. Sorry about that, everyone. Got a little bit lost. Okay. According to the commandment of the Lord, this is from the ESV, by the way. According to the commandment of the Lord to Joshua, he gave to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. I always get these names wrong. A portion among the people of Judah, Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. Arba was the father of Anak, and Caleb drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak, Sheshai, and Ahiman, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak. Man, this is killing me. All right. And he went up from there against the inhabitants of how did you say it?
Debir.
Debir. Now the name of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sefer.
I could be totally mispronouncing it. I don't know.
I don't know either. Yep.
But that's not important. What is important is that, okay, so this is 5 chapters after we see Joshua completely destroying everybody in Debir. That's what the text said. It said that Joshua killed everybody in that town and all the villages around it. And yet we see that in chapter 15, we don't know how long. It could have been a couple of months. It could have been a couple of years. We just don't know. Caleb then goes out to fight against the people living in Debir. But I thought they were all dead. I thought that you'd killed them all. So
Yeah.
which is it? Did you kill all of them or did you not? You know, is one of you lying? You know?
Yeah. And I think it comes down to the language. Like they're saying destroyed, but destroyed could mean just dismantled. It's not functional anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's just how they talk about it. Like the same way I would talk about a footy match kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which sounds crazy to compare this whole thing to the footy, but it's just it's just the best analogy I could come up with.
No, it's good. No, it's good. I think that's a good analogy. But I think what is important here, it's the same way that a fan of Geelong would talk about a win if their side won. You know, like they would use the same language that we completely destroyed you, we completely wrecked you. It's that whole bravado thing of my side beat your side and we completely demoralized you, we completely ground you into the dirt, sort of thing. Like that's how sports fans talk when they are trying to lord it over their friends who go for some different side when their side is the winner. And I think that's what the writer of Joshua is trying to do here. He's trying to reinforce how successful and how superior Israel and the God of Israel is to the Canaanites and their forces and their gods.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, like that's, and so what we're actually saying is like not to is to like, you know, a lot of people would say, oh, well, okay, if the language isn't accurate, then how I would see it, then I don't really need to read it or pay attention to it. That's actually the opposite of what we're saying. You actually need to pay more attention to the little details, because otherwise you'd miss a detail like this. Like the name is repeated, but often we miss it because all these names seem so foreign to us.
Yeah.
So this is why we like to are telling people, hey, pay more attention as you read scripture. Look deeply at the language. Read it from a couple of different translations. Oh, shock and horror. There's no perfect translation, you know. But again, like things just don't necessarily translate into English and also into our modern language. So it's important to read and to pay close attention to details. And, you know, like that's how you pick up stuff like this. Yeah. Anyway, so
it's hard to say this, but I think it has to be said, and that is that these ancient biblical writers are not putting the same pressure on you, the modern reader, that perhaps you thought they are. They're not expecting you to take every word literalistically, you know, taking like it had to happen that way. That's a really hard pill to swallow, and I know and I understand that a lot of people will not be able to do that, or will have a really hard time doing that, because then you start to wonder, well, what do I take literally and what don't I take literally? You know, that's, you know, I understand. I wouldn't expect you to accept that. But when it comes to things like these, a more careful, nuanced approach that doesn't expect everything to be taken literally, I think is the best approach.
Yeah, it's taking it as truth. Yeah. Like, I don't know, that's an interesting thing. Maybe we should do an episode on that one day too.
Yeah,
that's
maybe.
a lot harder to cover. We'd probably need a specialist to come in on that one.
Yeah.
And
look, there's a lot of different examples of this. We don't have time to go into any of these other examples, but there are a whole bunch of other examples that I've found of the same story told from two different sides, and each of them having valuable information to convey, but ultimately, unfortunately, when it comes down to it, a lot of what we read is biblical writers coming from a biased place, and that's just how things were back then. And I don't think that a heck of a lot has changed. I think we just have learned to hide it a lot better.
Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah. Well, we're pretty much out of time, but we've got one last point, but it won't take too long. And let's remember, the Bible's pretty clear on the fact that Jesus is meant to be the ultimate revelation and the ultimate picture of who God actually is in the way that we can see God. We are supposed to be able to see God the most clearly through Jesus. And so when Jesus comes, how does he come? He doesn't come as a warlord. He doesn't come like Genghis Khan or Napoleon or something like that. He just comes to serve people, to heal people, to bring love and to teach, and he comes to very humble beginnings as well, born into not a particularly rich family, into a manger, all that kind of stuff. He's carpenter for the first 30 years, all that kind of stuff. His ending picture is that he actually died for those that he loved. He laid down his life for his friends, for us.
Yeah.
So that everybody could be a part of this Israel, this nation that God wants to lift up, this kingdom of heaven that he's trying to build, these people who follow Jesus. That's the picture of God. And so when we look at this stuff in the Old Testament and we think, how is that God being just? How is that God being good? Well, okay, let's look at this through the lens of looking at Jesus and how he came. The big theological word there is to look at the Old Testament, Christoically, I think it is.
Christologically.
Okay, anyway.
Or Christocentrically?
I don't know. Yeah. Someone should correct us on that. So, yeah, I mean, like, that's the picture of God to start with now for us. We are so blessed that we are on the other side of that we can see that picture of Jesus. And we can see that picture of God through Jesus. And so we can look at the rest of the story retrospectively through Jesus. That's the big picture here. And that's what's exciting. And that's what, we're so lucky where we are right now. We have no idea, but we really are. And so that's where I wanted to land the plane. Anything else to add to that, Jesse?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to land it, that ultimately Jesus' weapons of war, unlike Joshua and the Israelites, was love, and that Joshua, I think Joshua triumphed over the sin and darkness of the Canaanite Empire, despite having to use violence. But I think Jesus then he takes that and he inverts it, and he wins, he triumphs by being subject to violence. Joshua won his victories through the shedding of his enemy's blood, whereas Jesus won his victory ultimately through the shedding of his own blood.
Preach. So good.
So I don't think that... Yes! Wow, that wasn't even intentional. But hey, man, that's the gospel. That's the gospel. And I don't think that we can look at the conquest and see, okay, well, this is evidence of an angry God, and then over here we have a God of love. I think that God of love comes through even in the midst of the conquest. And I hope that our discussion has illustrated that, because ultimately that is the God that Jesus portrays as he is hanging on the cross, dying for the sins of the whole world.
Oh, so good. I love the gospel. Every time I hear it, man. So good. All right. So thank you guys. We'd love to hear your feedback on this episode. I'm sure there will be a lot of feedback on this episode. Thank you for listening. Sorry we've gone a bit longer than normal. But we just... we know this is a big thing, and if we need to keep talking about it, keep going into it, let us know. Let us know your questions, your thoughts, so we can help make content that's going to be beneficial to you guys. So the best place to find all things Burn the Haystack is, of course, burnthehaystack.org. Make sure you go there, check it out. It's got links to our social and even a way to directly contact us through the website.
Absolutely. And you can listen to our latest episode on the front page of burnthehaystack.org, so you never miss a thing. Speaking of which, if you have not already subscribed to this podcast, please subscribe to it on whatever podcatching app that you find most useful. We are on basically everything that you can imagine. And if there is one thing that we are not on, let us know and we'll try and get onto it. But I'm pretty sure we are literally on every podcatching platform almost out there.
Yep. I know Google has some troubles with this sometimes, but it seems to, because we're not in the US, but then it seems to fix itself. So
it is a continual mystery to me how that works, and I do not understand it in the slightest.
Like many things.
Yeah.
Mystery of the Bible.
Yeah. And if you would like to help us out, you can do that by leaving us a rating or a review on your podcatching app of choice. If your podcatching app of choice does not have functionality, just head over to iTunes on Apple Podcasts, and I need to stop saying iTunes, but yeah, it's on Apple Podcasts, and leave us a review there. Helps us to get more exposure, get more listeners, and get the good word out there more.
Absolutely. So good. Thank you, everybody. Stay awesome. We love you. That is Josh and Jesse out. So, quick question about Lord of the Rings lore before I have to go to a meeting. I'm running late, but
Yep. Yes.
The big, the big orcs. I forgot what they're called. The one that they got like the handprint. Huh?
Uruk-hai.
Yeah.
Yep.
What are they? I thought they were the elves.
No. Uruk-hai are a blend between men and orcs. So that's pretty disgusting.
Is there like a... Okay, I don't want to know the story, but is there like a...
I don't know.
Is there lore behind how they came about?
I don't know how they reproduce, but I think it was... So Saruman was the one who was responsible for creating the Uruk-hai. I think his idea was to... I think they're the Dunlendings. They're basically hill people that are like the enemies of the Rohirrim, the Rohan.
Right, yeah.
They live in Dunland.
Rohan is like Aragorn, right?
No, Rohan is the horse people, like the Celtic horse people.
Oh, right. Yep.
Yeah. So the Uruk-hai, I think, are like Saruman's idea was to blend the strength and the height of a man with the viciousness and the toughness of an orc. Hence why the Uruk-hai. Yeah.
And you can do it through like magic and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So when you see it in the movies, like I don't think from memory, it's been a long time since I've read Lord of the Rings last, but from memory, I don't think it goes into detail about how it happens. But in the movie, you see the Uruk-hai being birthed basically from these slimy pods.
Yeah. I thought I thought in the movie was that they were like an ancient orc or something, and he was pulling them out of the mud. Like they were like, it's like they'd been preserved in there or something, is what I thought when I watched it.
No.
That's how it painted it to me.
Okay, yeah. No, but, I mean, that I can see why you would think that. I think that he's just doing it. He's just playing with the gene pool and, doing some mad scientist sort of experiments sort of thing.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah, I don't think it gives that picture in the movie.
No.
Because they're mining it. It makes it seem like they're ancient. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Yeah.
No, orcs and goblins originally were corrupted by the original Dark Lord, Morgoth. And they were elves that went and served him. And over time, they were corrupted to the point where they became orcs. Sort of how, like, in Oblivion, like, I don't know if you remember the... is it the Snow Elves? Become...
I never played Oblivion.
Or Skyrim. Did you play Skyrim?
Yeah, I played Skyrim. But
the Falmer? You remember the Falmer?
Oh, yeah.
They're like them. They used to be elves, but they become so corrupted that they live underground, and that's why orcs don't... it's the same sort of shtick. Like, orcs don't like sunlight, so they won't go out in sunlight, unlike the Uruk-hai, who, because they are half man, half human, they go out in sunlight.
Oh.
And they don't care.
So that's why all the attacks are at night.
Yes, that's right. And that's why, like, when Sauron sends his armies to attack Minas Tirith, he sends those clouds ahead of him so that, to ease the passing of the orcs.
Wow. That is fascinating. All right.
Yeah.
Cool. My questions have been answered.
Cool.
Okay.
Should I include that in the episode?
Oh, yeah, true. We're still recording. You can. It depends how long it is. I don't want people to be like, whoa, this episode's like an hour and 30 minutes. I'm not listening to that. When really 30 minutes of it is us just geeking out.